Why did the laughter cut so deep when she hadn't even spoken yet? She stood at the gate, her frame outlined in the sharp glow of floodlights that made every flaw visible. Sarah's boots were scuffed, splitting at the seams. Her faded blue jacket hung off her shoulders as if it had carried more than just her weight for years. Her black hair, tangled and uneven, caught in the cold wind like torn threads of a flag that had seen too many battles. She looked like a stray that had wandered onto sacred ground, a ground she didn't deserve to touch, not according to the polished boots and pressed uniforms lined up around her. The sergeant at the desk sneered as he yanked the fabric backpack from her shoulder. His hand was rough, not out of necessity, but out of something more primal, disdain. A crowd gathered, the whispers thick in the cold night air. She didn't need to hear their words to know what they meant. Nobody, useless, wrong place. Her bag landed on the desk with a thud. Items spilled out one by one. Worn gloves, creased socks, scraps of paper that seemed like the remnants of a life pieced together on the margins. The recruits laughed, some openly, some behind their hands. To them, she was an intruder, an imposter with no right to stand at their gates. And yet Sarah did not flinch. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but her spine stayed tall, like she had been standing under harsher lights long before this moment. The whispers could gnaw, the sneers could bite, but she remained steady, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the present ridicule. Sergeant Kyle, young, buzzcut, drunk on his stripes, smirked as if this moment belonged to him. "Did anyone tell you you're at the wrong place?" His voice rang louder than it needed to, designed to invite the chorus of laughter that immediately followed. It worked. A couple of recruits chuckled, their eyes darting between him and Sarah like they were watching a comedy skit instead of a search. But Sarah's silence wasn't weakness. It was pressure building, waiting. A female recruit shoved past her to the desk, eyeliner sharp, ponytail pulled so tight it seemed to ache just looking at it. Her voice dripped venom. "Logistics waits outside." Her tone made logistics sound like filth. Like the ground itself had rules Sarah had violated simply by breathing near them. Still, Sarah didn't break. She looked at the woman with calm eyes, steady as stone. "I have a summons." The words weren't loud, weren't defensive. They were deliberate, a fact. For a moment the room faltered. The sharp-edged recruit froze, rolled her eyes, and muttered something under her breath as she turned away. But that pause, that half-second of silence, wasn't lost. Not to the captain watching, not to the corporal leaning against the desk with a pen flicking between his fingers. The corporal leaned in, his voice mocking, smoke-stained. "Summons, huh? What's a girl like you doing with a summons? You look like you're here to clean barracks, not save the day." The laughter doubled. A joke, cheap and cruel, passed around like ammunition. But Sarah's hand only tightened on the strap of her bag, just for a breath, then loosened again. She tilted her head, her gaze slicing into him like a blade through fabric. "Maybe I'm here to do both." The laughter died, not because her words were shouted, but because they were sharp. Quiet, cutting, undeniable. The corporal's pen stilled mid-click, the silence more powerful than their laughter had ever been. Kyle wouldn't let it end there. His smirk widened, but beneath it something faltered. He grabbed her arm, tugging her toward the desk. Not violent, but firm enough to say, "You don't belong. Let's see what you got." The desk was chaos, clipboards, static radios, coffee rings staining wood. Kyle patted her down with careless hands, quick movements like he was checking a shoplifter at a convenience store. Nothing. No neat orders folded in her pocket. No ID. Just that battered backpack, stained, frayed, tired like its owner. The recruits leaned closer, whispers sharp, waiting for the crack, waiting for the imposter to collapse under the weight of exposure. But she didn't. Her eyes locked on something in the distance. Not the wall, not the officers, something only she could see. It unsettled them, because they couldn't name it, couldn't laugh at it. The captain stepped forward, his jaw granite, his boots echoing on concrete. He was older, harder. "If you were summoned, then by whom?" The question wasn't a challenge. It was a chance, one chance to prove herself. Sarah didn't hesitate. She looked him in the eye, steady, unshaken, and spoke a string of words that sounded like nonsense to everyone else. A phrase, a code. The effect was immediate. The captain froze, his face stilled as though time itself had stopped for him. It was a phrase buried in protocol, one abandoned 8 years ago. Black tier, decommissioned, classified, buried, only a ghost of memory. The recruits didn't understand, but they saw the way the captain's eyes changed, saw the stillness ripple across the room. Even the static radios seemed to quiet, as if they, too, were listening. Kyle laughed, but his voice cracked like glass. The more elaborate the fake, the more we should search her. The captain ignored him. A gesture summoned MPs who flanked Sarah instantly. They weren't rough. They weren't mocking. They moved with caution. She walked between them, her boots echoing softly against pavement. The whispers swelled behind her, a mixture of confusion and unease. Jeers followed, voices shouting charity case. But she didn't turn, didn't look back. She walked as though carrying something heavier than her bag, something invisible but undeniable. The MPs exchanged glances. Their grips tightened, not out of fear of her, but fear of something else, something unspoken. Inside the sterile waiting room she sat, backpack on her lap, fingers curled tightly around the strap. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the air smelled of bleach and burnt coffee. Kyle swaggered in, shadow falling across her. His voice sharp, brittle, "Take off the backpack, or I'll rip it open myself." Sarah lifted her eyes, calm. "What's inside isn't meant for you." The words weren't angry, they weren't desperate, but they carried weight. So much weight that for a heartbeat, Kyle hesitated. He shook it off with mockery, yanked the bag. One by one he emptied her life across the cold table, socks, gloves, a faded photo, her mother's face smiling, softened by age. The recruit snickered. A female officer mocked the picture, voice dripping with disdain. "Bet she's real proud of you showing up here like this." Sarah's hand twitched, just for a second, but she didn't reach for the photo. Her voice, quiet but final, "She was." The laughter dimmed, not completely, but the sharpness dulled. Kyle dug deeper, still searching for something to destroy. A rusty folding knife clattered on metal, a half-empty pack of gum, a notebook with empty pages. Each item fed the crowd's derision. Until his hand found something solid. A small box, dark metal, no labels, heavier than steel. The smirk faded. His hands fumbled as he tried to open it. It didn't budge. He shook it, unsettled, before passing it to another officer who mocked it like a toy. Laughter rose again. Sarah rose slowly, her hand extended. "Give it back." Her tone wasn't pleading. It wasn't even commanding. It was final. The laughter drained from the room. Kyle's smirk crumbled, and almost instinctively he returned the box to her. The air thickened, heavy. Her fingers brushed its surface, deliberate. She pressed 3 symbols, motions no one else could know. A soft click. The lid sprang open. The room froze. Inside, a metal deep blue with silver edges, engraved with 2 serpents twisted together, and words that hadn't been spoken in years. Delta Zero. Kyle's mouth hung open. A major staggered forward and stopped, pale as chalk. That doesn't exist. That's supposed to be a myth." The recruits fell silent. The colonel entered, boots echoing, eyes landing on the metal. He removed his cap, stood at attention. No words, just the silence of recognition. Sarah sat, the metal in her lap. Her fingers rested on it lightly, and her voice, low, quiet, steady, cut through the weight of the room. "Looks can lie." No one spoke. The silence itself felt alive. And in that moment, the world began to shift. How could one object silence a room full of soldiers trained to mock, to dominate, to dismiss? The answer lay on Sarah's lap, glinting faintly under the buzz of fluorescent lights. The metal was no larger than a palm, yet it pulled the air taut, like gravity itself had changed. Its surface shimmered with a shade of blue that didn't belong in the natural world, deep, metallic, edged in silver. The serpents twisted around each other in a pattern so intricate it seemed alive. But it wasn't just the metal, it was what it meant. Every officer in that room knew what Delta Zero whispered of. A myth, a story passed between veterans who had seen too much and trusted too little, a protocol decommissioned, erased, denied. And yet here it was, in the hands of a woman with no insignia, no rank, no polished boots. Kyle swallowed hard, his earlier smirk shattered. He looked like a boy caught holding fire. She probably bought it online, some replica, a trinket. The words fell flat. The colonel turned on him so sharply it was like the air cracked. Put it down, now. His voice was low, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. His hand twitched like it wanted to strike, like the mere suggestion of doubt was an insult. Kyle hesitated. His knuckles whitened around the edge of the box, trembling as if the metal itself burned. Then he dropped it onto the table. The sound was sharp, final, like a gavel. Sarah didn't move fast. She didn't need to. She reached out, closed the lid with a soft snap, and rested her hand on top of it. Calm, steady, silent. "Looks can lie," she said. The words rippled through the room. Soldiers shifted in their boots. Eyes darted away. Laughter, once easy, now impossible. A lieutenant with a pinched face broke the silence, desperate to claw back control. "So what? She's got a medal, could have stolen it. People like her don't get recognition like this. Look at her." His arms crossed, his lips curled, but his voice wavered. "She doesn't look the part." Sarah's eyes flicked to him, calm as a still lake. "And what part is that?" The question landed like a weight. He faltered, chewing his lip faster, words slipping away. His arms crossed tighter as if squeezing himself together might hide the crack. No one came to his defense. A tech officer hurried to set up a secure laptop, his fingers tapping nervously as he typed her name into the system. Sarah Moore. The screen pulsed red, a warning. "This file is under the supervision of the Intercontinental Security Council." The officer froze. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, too afraid to speak. A general leaned forward, his face unreadable, his voice no louder than a whisper. "I once heard of a medal never disclosed, awarded to someone who saved the world 3 times without anyone knowing." The words hung there, heavy, unbelievable, terrifying. Sarah didn't confirm, didn't deny. Her gaze stayed level, her voice even. "I didn't come here to be recognized." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crushing. Not one soul dared meet her eyes. From the hallway, the sound of a broom scraping tile broke the stillness. An older janitor leaned against the doorway, gray hair thinning, limp evident, uniform faded but clean. He had been invisible until now. His voice cracked like gravel when he spoke. "I knew a Moore once, long time ago. She was quiet like you, saved my unit in 03. Every head turned. Sarah's hand paused on the box. Her eyes found his, steady, searching. For a moment they shared something unspoken, a nod subtle but real. The janitor's hands shook on the broomstick. He stepped back into the hallway, his presence fatting again, but the weight of his words lingered. The officers didn't notice. They were still caught in the undertow of the laptop's warning, still staring at the impossible metal, still trying to place Sarah in a world they had never imagined. But one man tried to push back. A sergeant, all muscle and bravado, crossed his arms and stepped forward. "You think that's enough? A medal? You still need to go through training like everyone else." His voice was loud, desperate, reaching for order in the storm. A captain, scowling, nodded. "No paperwork, no rank. A medal isn't a resume." Sarah didn't argue, didn't claim privilege. She only nodded, her face unreadable. "I agree. I'll take your test." That was when the air shifted again. It wasn't submission. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, a quiet readiness that unsettled the very foundation of the room. They led her to the range. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of wet earth and old gunpowder. Floodlights cast harsh shadows over rows of targets set 50 yards out. The recruits trailed behind, whispering, some betting she'd fail, others just watching, eyes hungry for cracks. A supply clerk stepped in their way, clipboard trembling in his hands. "No clearance, no entry," he stammered, his voice nasal. "Rules are rules." The recruit smirked, ready for another humiliation. Sarah stopped. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She simply extended her hand. The clerk hesitated before handing her the form. She scanned it, calm, deliberate. Her finger pointed to a single line at the bottom. "Check the signature." His eyes squinted, lips moving as he read. Then his face paled. The name etched at the bottom was one no one dared question. He swallowed hard, stepped aside, clipboard shaking. No more smirks, no more laughter. The range lay before her, silent except for the wind. Sarah stepped to the line. A standard-issue handgun was placed in her hand. No special scope, no ear protection, just her, the weapon, and 50 yards of distance that separated the believers from the doubters. The captain signaled. She raised the gun, smooth, controlled, not the hesitant hand of a logistics volunteer, not the fumbling grip of someone untrained. Her arms were steady, her breath measured, her eyes narrowed. The shot cracked. And then silence. 3 targets fell. 1 bullet, 3 clean holes. The recruits' whispers died in their throats. The smirks vanished. Even the captain, hardened and stern, found his jaw tightening in disbelief. The instructor, old, weathered, silent until now, stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "I've seen that shot before, 10 years ago, in a place we don't talk about. 1 bullet, 3 targets. Only one person could do that." He didn't look at Sarah. Didn't need to. His words alone turned the air heavy again, like confession and recognition all at once. The recruits stood still. Some shifted uneasily, some stared, but none mocked, none dared. And Sarah. She set the gun down, walked away. Her boots crunched over gravel, her backpack still slung over her shoulder, her face unreadable. Not pride, not defiance, just quiet, just steady. Behind her, the instructor's words lingered, a ripple that refused to fade. And for the first time since she stepped through the gates, no one laughed. Why didn't she look back when the world behind her had just shattered? The shooting range still smelled of gunpowder, the echoes of her shot lingering in the air long after the wind had swallowed the sound. 3 targets down, 1 bullet, a trick of skill, a whisper of legend. No one spoke as she walked away, her steps steady, her boots crunching gravel like a metronome in a room where everyone else had lost their rhythm. Sarah didn't need applause. She didn't crave validation. She hadn't stayed to see their faces twist from mockery to disbelief. She left them in silence, because silence, she knew, could cut deeper than noise. Behind her, recruits shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at the targets like the holes might rearrange themselves if they blinked long enough. Others whispered half-hearted excuses, wind patterns, blind luck, coincidence, but none dared to say the words out loud. The instructor, weathered and scarred, had already said enough. His voice still hung in their ears. "I've seen that shot before, 10 years ago, in a place we don't talk about." And in that place, only one name had lingered. Only one set of hands had carried the impossible like it was routine. But no one spoke her name, not yet. Sarah moved through the corridors of the base like she had walked them 100 times before. Each step, though ordinary, carried weight. The kind of weight that bent the air, making officers straighten without knowing why, recruits step aside without realizing it. The whispers followed, shadows clinging to her presence. Who is she? How? Why now? In the briefing room, she sat alone at the long metal table. The folder they had handed her lay open in front of her, a task force list, names, missions, locations, some circled, some crossed out. Her eyes scanned the pages without hurry. She didn't flip quickly. She didn't frown. She simply read steady as though she'd been expecting each line. The door creaked. A young private entered balancing a tray of coffee. His hands trembled, cups rattling as he set it down. One tipped, spilling across the table. "Oh God, I'm sorry," he stammered, scrambling for a rag. His voice cracked with panic, fear of reprimand tightening his throat. Sarah didn't move. She let the liquid spread, slow and dark. Then, as the private's hands fumbled, she reached forward, calm. She lifted the papers just high enough to spare them, handed him the rag. "It's fine." Her tone was soft, firm, final. The private froze, staring at her like she had just given him more than mercy. His breath hitched. He nodded quickly, mumbling apologies as he backed out of the room, nearly tripping on the threshold. Sarah lowered the papers again. Not a ripple of irritation crossed her face. She continued reading as though the coffee had never spilled. But outside the briefing room, things were far less calm. Kyle, the sergeant who had once held her backpack like it was evidence of fraud, sat stiff in the colonel's office. His stripes stripped, his career broken. He emerged an hour later, pale as chalk, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. The whispers spread before his boots even left the corridor. His downfall was sudden, permanent, inevitable. The female recruit with the sharp eyeliner didn't last long either. A video surfaced that same night, her shoving Sarah, sneering. By morning, it had gone viral, her name attached like a brand. Her commanding officer pulled her aside before noon. By evening, she was gone. Her file erased, her place scrubbed clean. One by one, those who had mocked Sarah felt the weight of consequences they couldn't explain. The officer who had mocked protocols found his sponsorship for promotion withdrawn without a word. The lieutenant who had dismissed the medal as a trinket was reassigned to a remote post, his protests ignored. He had been seen outside the colonel's office, phone pressed to his ear, muttering frantic excuses to someone who never answered. His shoulders sagged, his lips chewed raw. The punishment wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. The air carried the message clearly enough. And yet Sarah herself didn't seek revenge. She didn't watch their falls. She didn't linger in the corridors where their careers bled out. She was already elsewhere, her eyes fixed on the list in front of her, her focus untouched by petty triumphs. It wasn't pride that drove her. It wasn't vindication. It was something colder, sharper, deeper. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here because she had to be. The officers who remained at the briefing table stood stiff, their faces blank, their eyes locked on the walls. They didn't laugh now. They didn't question. They barely breathed. Sarah's fingers traced down the page of names, stopping at one. She tapped it lightly, then folded the paper over, as if marking it in her mind. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't a private. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, gray at his temples. His presence didn't roar. It didn't demand. It simply existed, and the room shrank around him. The colonel straightened, the officers snapped into rigid silence. Her husband. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was a statement no one dared challenge. The officers shifted under the weight of him. One tried to speak, to offer an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. Another stared at the floor, face burning with shame. The colonel removed his cap again, his salute trembling. Sarah rose slowly. She closed the folder, tucked it beneath her arm, and walked toward the door. Her husband fell into step beside her, his hand brushing hers. Not gripping, not pulling, just there. The silence of the room followed them, heavy and unbroken. But not everyone stayed silent. In the hallway, a recruit stood frozen. Barely 19, his face still soft with youth, his hands trembling as if he had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been one of the quiet ones, the ones who hadn't joined the laughter but hadn't spoken against it either. As Sarah passed, he swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what they said." His voice cracked, fear laced every syllable. Sarah stopped, her eyes met his. For a moment her face softened. Her voice was low, almost gentle. "You didn't say it." The recruit's eyes widened, tears rising unbidden. He nodded, his shoulders straightening as though a weight had lifted. She moved on, her husband at her side, the world bending silently around her steps. No one saluted. No one dared. Respect wasn't demanded, it wasn't ordered, it was felt. Outside, the sky hung heavy gray clouds folding over the horizon. The wind caught her hair, tangled it across her face. She paused for a moment, her boots on gravel, her eyes on the horizon. Her hand slipped into her bag, brushing against the metal box. She closed her eyes, only for a heartbeat. The pain was still there, the memories sharp, the weight unbearable. But so was the strength. She opened her eyes again, stepped forward. And the base, with all its whispers and judgments, faded behind her. What truth was she carrying that made even generals lower their eyes? Sarah's footsteps echoed through the corridor, steady, measured. Every sound seemed louder now, every scrape of her boot on the tile, every creak of the old base doors. Behind her, whispers rose and fell like waves she never turned to hear. In front of her, doors opened without her asking, not from fear of her, but from fear of what she might represent. The folder was still under her arm, its weight nothing compared to the invisible burden pressing against her shoulders. Her husband walked beside her, his silence protective, his presence alone reshaping the air of every room they entered. Yet Sarah's face remained calm, unreadable, as though none of it mattered. But it did matter, it always had. The metal still pressed against her bag, cool metal searing her with memories she hadn't asked to carry. She had once sworn never to open that box again, and yet fate, or duty, or something crueler, had dragged her back to it. The mess hall fell silent when she entered. Forks froze midair, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Recruits stared at their trays, officers stiffened in their seats. The hush was louder than any greeting could have been. She sat alone at the far end of a table. Her husband stood near the doorway, watching, his eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. It wasn't the stares that gnawed at Sarah. It was the distance. The kind of distance that told her she had been placed in a category beyond them, neither friend nor foe, but something untouchable. And untouchable always came with suspicion. A whisper carried across the room. Why her, why now? Another, if it's real, why isn't she wearing it? Sarah ate slowly, each bite deliberate, not rushing, not stalling. Her hands moved like she had learned long ago that small acts of control were the only way to survive scrutiny. But even as she sat, her mind drifted backward, to the nights when the metal had been more than just metal, when the serpents engraved into its surface had meant choices, sacrifices, when silence had saved lives but shredded her own. She blinked once, grounding herself in the sterile light of the hall. The voices returned, the buzz of fluorescent lamps humming over the muted room. Her husband caught her glance. A flicker of understanding passed between them, wordless. He knew. He had always known. But the recruits didn't. To them, she was an anomaly, a ghost of something never meant to exist. And in the absence of understanding, suspicion grew. Later that night, she found herself back in the briefing room, alone, save for the folder and the endless hum of the base around her. The lights cast harsh shadows across the table, long and sharp, as if cutting her apart. She opened the folder again. Names, faces, places. Each page carried weight not just of ink but of lives tethered to it. She lingered on one page longer than the others. Her lips parted slightly, as though speaking a name she refused to let out. Her hand hovered over the metal box in her bag. She didn't open it this time. Just touched it the way someone might press a scar through cloth, acknowledging its presence, never revealing it. But the door creaked, and her hand stilled. It was the young recruit from earlier, the one who had apologized. His eyes were wide, his frame tense like he had stumbled into forbidden ground. "I'm sorry," he blurted again, though no one had asked. I had to say it twice, because once doesn't feel enough." Sarah studied him quietly. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. His uniform hung a little loose, his boots too clean, his shoulders too stiff. He was still trying to grow into the idea of a soldier. "You didn't laugh," Sarah said softly. He shook his head, swallowing. "No, but I didn't stop them either." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Sarah's expression. Not disappointment, not pity, something gentler, something harder to name. "Silence can be strength," she said, her voice low, "but sometimes it can be consent." The boy's throat worked, his eyes welled, though he fought it. I should have said something." Sarah closed the folder, sliding it away from him. "You will. Next time, that's enough." Her words weren't a command. They were a promise, left hanging like a torch for him to carry forward. The boy nodded, stiff and awkward, but there was determination in it. He left the room straighter than he had entered. Sarah sat back, alone again, her fingers brushing the metal box once more. She let the silence hold her for a long time. But the silence didn't last. Two officers entered without knocking. Their steps were deliberate, their eyes sharp. One was the lieutenant who had sneered at her earlier, his lip chewed raw. The other was a captain who wore his authority like armor. "You think you can just walk in here and skip the system?" the captain snapped. His tone wasn't as confident as he wanted it to be. It cracked faintly at the edges. Sarah didn't rise, didn't flinch. "I didn't walk in, I was summoned." The lieutenant snorted, desperate to find ground to stand on. "By who? By what ghost? You think we'll just take your word because you carry a trinket?" His voice was too loud, trembling under the weight of his own fear. Sarah's gaze lifted, calm, unshaken. "You think it's a trinket? Check the back." The captain frowned, stepping closer to the box she had laid on the table. He hesitated before flipping it over. There, etched in impossibly fine lines, was a sequence of codes, passcodes, numbers and letters no civilian, no ordinary soldier could ever see. Black tier, level sealed. The captain's face drained of color. He stepped back, lips parting soundlessly. The lieutenant's bravado shattered. He stammered, grasping at excuses. Could be forged, could be. But even he didn't believe his words anymore. His eyes darted to the floor, his lip bleeding from how hard he bit it. Sarah closed the box again, her hand resting lightly on it. "Looks can lie," she repeated, her voice so soft it almost disappeared. The captain nodded stiffly, turned, and left without another word. The lieutenant followed, his shoulders hunched, his silence louder than all his earlier mockery. Sarah remained at the table, the hum of the lights filling the room again. She didn't smile, didn't sigh, didn't savor the moment. Because she knew the weight hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown. Recognition was never freedom. It was a chain, a reminder of debts unpaid and burdens unshared. And as she sat there, the folder before her, the medal beside her, she understood what the silence meant. It wasn't respect, it wasn't fear. It was waiting. Waiting for her to reveal why she had come back. Waiting for her to carry what no one else could. And Sarah, as steady as stone, knew she would. Why did they still watch her as if she might break, when she hadn't even bent? The base was different now. The same floodlights burned, the same radios crackled with static, the same boots echoed down the same corridors, but the air had changed. Wherever Sarah walked, conversations stuttered. Recruits stiffened, officers glanced away. No one laughed anymore. Yet silence was not acceptance. Suspicion simmered beneath the quiet. Doubt clung to her shadow. For every stare of awe, another of fear. For every lowered head, another whispered why her. The test at the range had silenced mockery. But silence, Sarah knew, was only the first layer. Silence had teeth. Silence had questions, and questions left unanswered could turn to poison. The colonel summoned her the next morning. She entered the room without hesitation. His desk was bare except for a file and a steaming mug of black coffee. His eyes, sharp and weathered, flicked from the file to her face, studying her with the precision of a man who had measured soldiers his entire life. "You don't wear rank," he said finally. "You don't carry orders, and yet you stand here with something I've only heard whispers of." Sarah didn't reply. "You took the range test. You passed." He leaned back, fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "But one test isn't enough. We need more than skill. We need proof of loyalty, proof of stability." The word lingered, stability, a quiet insult hidden in plain sight. Sarah's gaze didn't falter. "What's the test?" The colonel's eyes narrowed, as though waiting for hesitation. When none came, he slid the file across the desk. She opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, satellite images, dossiers, maps with red circles scrawled in marker. An abandoned industrial complex on the edge of a desert, rust bleeding down its walls, windows shattered, shadows lurking inside. "Recon," the colonel said. "Alone, no escort, no support." A test, then, not of firepower, not of obedience, of endurance, of judgment. Sarah closed the file and set it back on the desk. "When do I leave?" The colonel studied her a moment longer before answering. "Now." No time to prepare, no time to question, only now. The desert air bit at her skin as she stepped from the transport. The sky stretched vast and cloudless above her, blue bleeding into infinity. The ground crunched dry beneath her boots, dust clinging to the seams. Ahead the complex loomed, metal gates bent and rusted, a chain-link fence broken in places. The wind whistled through jagged holes in the walls, carrying with it the smell of oil and something older, something that had rotted long before she arrived. Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag and moved forward. Her footsteps were deliberate, soft, each one a choice. She carried no heavy gear, no squad at her back, only her silence, her shadow, her breath. Inside, the air was colder. Concrete corridors stretched in both directions, lined with peeling paint and flickering lights that hadn't died completely. Her eyes adjusted, scanning every corner, every dark space that could conceal more than shadows. The silence pressed in. But silence never unnerved her. Silence had been her companion for years. Silence was where she had lived when others had forgotten her name. Her fingers brushed the wall as she moved, tracing the rough texture. It grounded her, kept her anchored in the present when the past threatened to rise. Because the past always rose in places like this, places where danger smelled of memory as much as of rust. Halfway down the corridor, she paused. A sound, soft, barely there, a scrape of something against concrete, not wind, not rats, something deliberate. She crouched, her body moving smooth and controlled, her breath slowed, her ears strained. Another scrape. She slipped the folding knife from her bag, not the weapon they'd given her, but the dull, rusty blade she'd carried for years. She turned it once in her hand, feeling the familiar weight. The sound came again. A figure emerged from the shadows, small, thin, not armed, at least not visibly, a boy, 12, maybe 13, clothes torn, face smudged with dirt, his eyes wide, frantic. He froze when he saw her. Sarah didn't move. She kept her stance low, her body relaxed, her knife held loosely at her side. Her voice was soft when she spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The boy shook his head quickly, his lips trembling. "Neither are you." A beat passed, the silence thickened. Then suddenly he bolted. Sarah didn't chase. She watched him disappear down the corridor, his footsteps echoing into nothing. Her hand tightened on the knife. The boy wasn't part of the test. He couldn't be. And yet. She stood, sliding the blade back into her bag. She walked slower now, her senses sharpened. Because if the boy was here, then others might be. And where there were others, there was danger. The complex stretched deeper, its corridors twisting like veins. She moved steadily, noting every exit, every broken door, every sound. Her breathing stayed even, her face calm. But inside, her chest ached with something heavier than caution. Children didn't wander, abandoned bases by accident. By the time she reached the central hall, the truth revealed itself. 3 more figures huddled in the shadows, older teenagers, their clothes ragged, their eyes wary. One clutched a pipe like a weapon, another shielded the youngest with his arm. They weren't soldiers, they weren't enemies. They were survivors. Sarah stopped at the edge of the hall. Her gaze swept over them, quick, precise, absorbing every detail, the tremor in their hands, the dirt under their nails, the way their eyes darted, searching for escape. She lowered her bag to the floor, slowly, deliberately. She raised her hands slightly, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you." The one with the pipe didn't relax. His voice cracked when he spoke, raw with fear disguised as anger. "You don't belong here." Sarah's eyes softened. "Neither do you." For a moment none of them moved. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Then she reached into her bag, not for the medal, not for the knife, but for the half-empty pack of gum Kyle had mocked earlier. She tore a piece free and set it on the ground, sliding it toward them. The youngest's eyes flicked to it. His lips parted. His hunger betrayed him. The one with the pipe tightened his grip, but Sarah only lowered her hands again. She didn't push. She didn't force. Patience was the language she spoke best. Finally, the youngest moved, crawling forward to snatch the gum. He chewed desperately, his face contorting as flavor met hunger. The others didn't stop him. Sarah sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, her movements calm, unthreatening. She didn't speak again. She let them watch her, let them decide. Minutes passed, the gum was gone, the pipe lowered slightly. And slowly, painfully, the silence shifted. When Sarah returned to the base hours later, the colonel was waiting. His eyes scanned her, searching for cracks, for signs of failure. "You're late," he said, his voice clipped. Sarah set her bag on the table. There were survivors inside, children. The colonel's jaw tightened. That wasn't part of the mission. Her gaze lifted, sharp and unyielding. "It was part of mine." The words cut deeper than defiance. They carried the weight of someone who had seen too much to let orders blind her. The colonel leaned back, his silence betraying more than his words could. He didn't reprimand her. He didn't praise her. He simply studied her, the same way a man studies a storm, unpredictable, unstoppable, inevitable. Sarah picked up her bag again. She didn't wait for dismissal. She didn't ask for approval. She simply walked out, her steps steady, the weight of silence following her once more. Because her test hadn't been about skill. It had never been about loyalty. It was about something far greater. And she had passed, not by obeying, but by remembering what silence could never erase. Why did saving lives feel like a mistake in a place built to protect them? When Sarah stepped back through the gates that night, silence followed her. Not the silence of awe this time, but the silence of unease. The MPs who had escorted her earlier now stood straighter, their hands tightening on their rifles though she was unarmed. Recruits in the courtyard stopped mid-conversation, their eyes trailing her steps like she was a specter drifting past. They knew she had returned from the mission. They knew she had walked into the abandoned complex and come out alive. But rumors already twisted through the air like smoke, rumors about who she had brought back with her. Children. Some whispered it as disbelief, others as condemnation. She broke orders, she interfered, she disobeyed. But no one said it to her face, not yet. Her husband met her outside the barracks. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried weight. He searched her expression for an answer she didn't give. He didn't ask. He never did. Rest was all he said. She nodded, though rest was the one thing she had forgotten how to do. The next morning, the colonel called her in. His office smelled of stale coffee and gun oil, the blinds casting harsh stripes of light across the desk. "You weren't sent there to save strays," he said flatly. His tone wasn't angry, it was controlled, calculated. The kind of tone commanders used when they wanted their words to wound without breaking discipline. Sarah stood before him, her face calm, her hands loose at her sides. I wasn't sent there to ignore them either. The colonel's jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, tapping one finger against the file on his desk. Orders exist for a reason. Boundaries exist for a reason. If everyone did what they felt was right, there'd be no army left to fight. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. Maybe that's the point. The colonel's eyes narrowed. For a long moment he said nothing, the air between them taut as wire. Finally he exhaled, slow and heavy. Do you know why I haven't dismissed you already? She didn't answer. Because part of me thinks you're exactly what this base needs, and another part of me thinks you're what will burn it down. He slid the file toward her. Inside were the same photographs as before, dossiers, maps, faces, but with one difference. At the bottom of the stack was a picture of her. Younger, eyes sharper, skin less worn, hair tied back. A photo that shouldn't exist anymore. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't touch it. The colonel studied her closely. You've been in places I can't put on record, done things no report can hold, and you've survived things no one should. His voice softened, almost despite himself. But survival doesn't mean peace. Sarah closed the file gently, sliding it back across the desk. Peace isn't why I'm here. The colonel's lips pressed into a thin line. He dismissed her with a nod, but his eyes followed her long after she left the room. Outside, the whispers had sharpened. Recruits who once mocked her now lowered their voices when she passed. Officers who had dismissed her now turned their eyes away, their silence heavy with judgment they didn't dare speak aloud. One night in the mess hall, she felt it fully. The room went quiet as she entered, trays clattering softer, conversations dying mid-sentence. She sat alone, as always, her food untouched. Across the room, two recruits muttered under their breath, too loud to be accidents. She brought them back. Kids, what's she trying to prove? Trying to get sympathy. Metal wasn't enough. Sarah didn't look up. She kept her gaze on her tray. But her hands tightened around her fork until her knuckles whitened. Her husband entered moments later, his presence alone silencing the whispers. He sat beside her, wordless, his hand brushing hers beneath the table, not holding, just there. And in that small touch, the tension in her grip loosened. That night sleep eluded her. She lay on her bunk, the barracks dark except for the sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. Her bag rested beneath the bed, the metal inside, its weight pressing against her chest even from a distance. Her eyes closed, and the past bled through. She was back in a different room years earlier. Not a barracks, not a base. A safe house somewhere forgotten. The air smelled of dust and sweat. She was younger then, her face sharper, her eyes harder. She held the same rusty knife, but her hands didn't tremble. Around her were men, soldiers, operatives, their uniforms stripped of insignia. Their eyes on her, waiting for her word. She remembered the weight of their stares. The weight of leadership she had never wanted but could never refuse. And she remembered the decision she made that night. A decision that saved lives. A decision that earned her the medal no one was supposed to know existed. But it also cost something. Something she had never spoken of, never written down, never confessed. Her eyes snapped open in the barracks, her breath sharp. The room was quiet. The medal still lay beneath her bed. She closed her eyes again, but this time she didn't drift back. She stayed awake until dawn. The next day, the fallout began. The recruits she had rescued, children with dirt still under their nails, were escorted off the base quietly, bundled in blankets, their eyes wide and frightened. No explanation was given to the ranks. No announcement was made. But rumors spread faster than orders. Some said Sarah had smuggled them in for sympathy. Others whispered they were bait, part of some larger test she had failed. A few even suggested they weren't children at all, but spies, decoys, ghosts she had imagined. Truth didn't matter, whispers did. Kyle, stripped of his stripes but not his bitterness, muttered loud enough for others to hear. "You can carry a medal, but it won't make you clean." He didn't say it in front of her, he didn't dare, but the poison spread. Sarah felt it in every glance, every pause in conversation, every silence that lasted too long. But she didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She carried the whispers the same way she carried the medal, in silence. Because silence, she knew, could be heavier than words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood outside the barracks, staring at the sky. The wind tugged at her hair, cold and sharp, but she didn't move. Her husband stepped beside her. He didn't speak at first. He just stood, his presence steady, his gaze on the same horizon. Finally, he asked quietly, "Was it worth it?" Sarah's eyes stayed forward. Her voice was steady but softer than usual. "It's always worth it." He studied her profile, the faint lines carved by years of weight she never put into words. He wanted to ask more, wanted to carry some of it for her, but he knew better. Some burdens weren't shared, they were endured. The sun disappeared, leaving only the quiet glow of the base lights behind them. And Sarah, unshaken, stepped back inside. That night the colonel received a call, a secure line, a voice older than his, heavier, sharper. "She's not here to train," the voice said. "She's not here to learn, she's here to lead." The colonel listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the medal lying in the file before him. He didn't argue. He didn't ask. He only nodded, though the voice on the other end couldn't see it. Because deep down, he already knew. Sarah Moore wasn't a recruit. She wasn't a volunteer. She wasn't even a soldier in the way they defined soldiers. She was something else. Something the world had tried to bury. And now she was back. Why did their fear grow louder than their laughter ever had? The medal had silenced the room. The test had silenced their mockery. But now, silence itself was beginning to turn against them. The base was restless. The air seemed to carry weight no order could disperse. Sarah walked its corridors like a shadow, present, undeniable, but never claimed. Recruits stiffened at her approach. Conversations faltered. Eyes trailed her like moths tracing flame, drawn but terrified of burning. And those who had once mocked her now lived in the long shadow of consequences. Kyle was gone, stripped, dismissed, a ghost haunting the barracks in whispers. His fall became a warning, his name a curse spat in quiet corners. Don't end up like Kyle. The sharp-eyed recruit with the eyeliner vanished too. One day her name was on the roster, the next it was gone, scrubbed as though she had never existed. The lieutenant who called her medal a trinket, reassigned to a post so remote that even rumors couldn't reach him. His lips still bled from constant chewing. His hands still trembled when anyone mentioned her name. And yet, none of these falls gave Sarah satisfaction. She hadn't asked for retribution. She hadn't sought it. The world simply bent around her presence, punishing those who had tried to break her without her lifting a finger. But respect born of fear is fragile. It curdles quickly. And in the quiet corners of the base, unease grew sharper. It began with small things. A recruit deliberately sliding his tray across the mess table so it wouldn't touch hers. An officer stepping out of a room the moment she entered, leaving his coffee behind still steaming. A door closing just a little too quickly when she approached. None of it loud, none of it direct. But Sarah felt it all. She had always lived in the spaces between words, in the weight of silence, in the unsaid. And she knew what it meant. They weren't rejecting her for weakness anymore. They were rejecting her for strength. For what she carried, for what she represented. And perhaps, most of all, for what they couldn't understand. One night she was summoned to the briefing hall. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp over the table where a file lay open. Inside were photographs again, different this time, Clearer, closer, faces of men whose eyes burned with malice, coordinates scrawled in the margins, weapons caches circled in red. It was a mission file. The colonel's voice was low, controlled, but laced with unease. "You're being placed on Task Force Gray." Sarah scanned the papers without a word. The silence stretched until the colonel shifted uncomfortably, as though her silence unnerved him more than enemy gunfire ever had. Finally, she closed the file. "Why me?" The colonel hesitated, then leaned forward. His words came out like gravel dragged across concrete, because some ghosts can only be fought by other ghosts. Sarah's gaze stayed steady, unreadable, and when the fighting's done. The colonel looked away. His silence was answer enough. That night Sarah sat outside the barracks, the stars sharp above her, the desert wind cool against her face. Her husband joined her quietly, lowering himself onto the bench beside her. "You're leaving again," he said softly. Sarah didn't answer. "You said you were done." His voice carried no anger, only quiet pain. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "I was." He turned to her, searching her face. "Then why?" She finally looked at him, and in her eyes was the weight of every silence she had ever carried. Because silence doesn't erase what's waiting in the dark. Her husband swallowed hard, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, wanted to hold her back, but he knew it would be like trying to hold the tide. Instead, he just placed his hand on hers, not gripping, not demanding, just there. And for a brief moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was soft. The next day, the base buzzed with preparation, vehicles fueled, weapons checked, radios tuned, but beneath the noise, the whispers remained. Some recruits watched Sarah with awe, whispering of her impossible shot at the range, her mettle that shouldn't exist, her calm that never cracked. Others whispered darker things, that she wasn't human, that she was cursed, that wherever she went, death followed. Sarah ignored them all. She had lived with whispers too long to let them guide her steps. But the whispers weren't harmless. They planted seeds, and seeds given time always grew. Before dawn, she stood in the armory. A young clerk handed her a rifle, his hands shaking slightly as he did. He avoided her eyes, his voice barely steady. "Here you go, ma'am." Sarah took it, her grip firm, her eyes lingering on him just long enough to soften his trembling. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the boy looked at her as though she had handed him more than kindness, as though she had given him permission to be human in a place that demanded steel. She checked the rifle with practiced hands, each motion smooth, automatic, yet deliberate. Her silence filled the room more than any barked order could have. When she left the armory, the boy exhaled in relief, his shoulders sagging. But even as she prepared for the mission, the past pressed closer. In the quiet moments, when the wind fell still and the base's noise faded, memories crept in. A dark room years ago, not a briefing hall, not a safe house, somewhere nameless. The air thick with smoke, the floor littered with maps and spent casings. She had stood there once, younger, her hands steady even as her heart broke. Orders had been clear. Withdraw, leave them. But she hadn't. She had stayed. And because she stayed, lives had been saved. Because she disobeyed, the world had spun forward one more day. And for that, they had given her the medal. A medal that came with no ceremony, no parade, no salute, only silence. And silence had been her companion ever since. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Sarah sat with her bag at her feet. She reached inside, her fingers brushing the cool metal box. She drew it out slowly, resting it on her lap. She didn't open it. She only stared at it, her reflection warped in the deep blue surface. The serpents twisted together, their gaze locked in eternal struggle. Her breath slowed, her chest ached, she closed her eyes. And for a brief moment, she wished she had left it buried. But wishes didn't change truth. The truth was here. The truth was heavy. and tomorrow she would carry it back into the dark. When she walked through the courtyard later that night, a recruit, barely older than the boy who had apologized before, stepped in her path. His voice trembled, but he forced it out anyway. "Ma'am, do you ever regret it? Whatever it was you did to get that medal?" Sarah paused. Her eyes studied him carefully, weighing his words, his intent. Her voice, when it came, was low. "Regret doesn't change what had to be done." The recruit swallowed, his shoulders sinking. But then she added, softer, "Regret just makes sure you remember." The boy nodded slowly, his eyes wide, his breath shaky. When she stepped past him, he didn't stop her. And she didn't look back. In the colonel's office, officers argued quietly about her. Some demanded she be removed, reassigned, silenced before her presence fractured the ranks. Others argued she was exactly what they needed, that her silence carried more weight than any speech could. The colonel said nothing. He only stared at the medal resting in its box on his desk, the serpent's eyes reflecting the dim light. Finally, he closed the lid. And in the silence that followed, the decision was made. Sarah Moore would not be dismissed. She would be unleashed. Why did they fear her silence more than any weapon she carried? The night before deployment, the base didn't sleep. Engines growled in the motor pool. Radios hissed static and coordinates. Boots pounded gravel in rehearsed drills. But beneath the noise, tension coiled tighter with each passing hour. The recruits pretended to polish rifles, to clean gear, but their eyes kept drifting to her. Sarah sat alone on the edge of a transport truck, her bag at her feet, the metal sealed inside. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She only breathed steady, like the weight pressing on her chest was nothing new. Her husband found her there, his shadow long in the floodlight glow. He stood for a while without speaking, just watching her shoulders rise and fall, her eyes fixed on nothing. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't have to prove anything to them." Sarah turned slightly, her face soft in the light. "I'm not proving it to them." He frowned, his jaw tight. "Then to who?" She lowered her gaze to the ground. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "To the ones who never came back." And with those words, the space between them filled with ghosts neither dared to name. Dawn came harsh and colorless. The convoy rolled out in silence, dust rising behind heavy tires. Sarah rode in the back of the lead truck, her rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon. The recruits around her shifted nervously, stealing glances when they thought she wouldn't notice. She noticed, but she didn't return their stares, because her mind was elsewhere. Every mile closer to the target drew the past nearer. Every vibration of the engine carried echoes of nights she had tried to bury. The industrial ruins appeared at the horizon like teeth jutting from sand, jagged, rusted, hollowed by years of neglect. But the silence around them was wrong, too still, too deliberate. The convoy halted, engines died, dust settled. The colonel's voice crackled over radio. "Gray team, advance." Sarah stepped off the truck. Her boots hit gravel with the weight of inevitability. The recruits followed, their nerves raw, their eyes darting. She didn't look back at them. She didn't need to. She already knew fear was clawing at their throats. Her breath was steady, her grip firm. Because she had walked into places like this before. And places like this never forgot. The first shot came from the second floor of a collapsed factory. A crack split the air, echoing across the ruins. One recruit dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Chaos exploded. Voices shouted, boots scattered, orders tangled. Sarah didn't flinch. She lifted her rifle, one smooth motion, and fired. The sniper's window shattered. Silence followed. Her calm steadied the recruits around her, not because she barked orders, not because she demanded, but because she simply stood, unshaken, when the world tilted. They moved forward again, slower now, tighter. Each corner was checked, each shadow held suspicion. Inside the ruins, the smell hit them first, oil, smoke, and something sourer older. The walls groaned under their weight. Broken glass crunched under boots. Sarah led, not by word but by step. In the heart of the complex, they found them. Men with rifles, scarred, hardened, their eyes burning with hatred that had fermented over years. The firefight erupted sharp and violent. Bullets tore concrete. Shouts cracked the air. The recruits panicked, some firing wildly, some freezing in place. Sarah moved like water, controlled, precise. Every shot deliberate, every step measured, not frantic, not reckless, just inevitable. One recruit stumbled, fear locking his knees. Sarah's hand gripped his shoulder, steadying him. Her voice cut through the chaos, low and calm. Breathe, aim, fire. And he did. For the first time, his bullet struck true. Minutes stretched into hours. When the smoke cleared, the recruits stood shaking, their faces pale, their hands trembling on rifles slick with sweat. But they were alive. Because Sarah had been there. Because she had stood when they faltered. Because silence had carried them where noise would have drowned them. On the transport ride back, no one laughed. No one whispered. They sat in silence, their eyes on the floor, their chests rising and falling with exhaustion. Sarah sat with her rifle across her lap, her gaze out the window. The desert rolled past, endless and quiet. One recruit finally spoke, his voice soft, almost reverent. "Who are you?" Sarah didn't answer. She only adjusted the strap of her bag, her hand brushing the metal inside. Her silence was her answer. Back at the base, the colonel awaited them. He scanned the convoy as soldiers disembarked, his eyes finally settling on Sarah. Reports were filed, injuries tallied, debriefs conducted, but the story that spread through the base was not written on paper. It lived in whispers, in stares, in the heavy quiet that followed her wherever she walked. No one dared mock her now. No one dared question the medal. But questions still lingered. Where had she come from? What had she done to earn it? And why, after all these years, had she returned? That night Sarah sat alone in the briefing room again. The medal lay on the table, its serpents twisting in the lamplight. She stared at it, her reflection warped in its surface. Her husband entered quietly, standing behind her for a long time before speaking. "You carried them through today." Sarah's eyes didn't leave the medal. "I only carried them as far as silence would let me." He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You think silence is enough?" Sarah finally looked up at him. In her eyes was the weight of years no words could hold. "Silence is the only thing that doesn't lie." He studied her, his expression heavy, then nodded slowly. And in that nod was recognition, not of victory, not of peace, but of truth. The next morning the base was quieter than ever. Recruits trained harder, officers spoke less, and whispers softened into awe they couldn't voice. But Sarah didn't linger for their respect. She packed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She walked to the edge of the base where the horizon stretched endless, her boots crunching gravel one steady step at a time. Her husband fell into stride beside her, silent as ever. She didn't look back, because she never needed to. The truth followed her in every bowed head, in every silence that filled the air long after she passed. She had never asked for their approval. She had never fought for their recognition. She had only stood quiet, steady, until the world finally caught up. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.